When the arrogant ranch owner ridiculed the humble horse trainer's worn clothes and simple background, his gentle approach to the wild Mustang revealed an extraordinary gift that left the entire auction crowd speechless and the wealthy spectators staring in disbelief. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Triple Crown auction house in Silverdale Valley was unusually crowded that Saturday morning. The summer heat pressed through the tall windows of the arena, making the industrial fans work overtime as they stirred the dust-filled air. The wooden bleachers creaked under the weight of curious spectators who had gathered to witness the day's proceedings. Lot number 47 had drawn particular interest, a dispute between Ravenwood Ranches and Gabriel Mendoza, a 65-year-old horse trainer whose family had worked with wild horses for generations. Ravenwood claimed ownership of a recently captured wild Mustang stallion that had been roaming lands they had purchased, while Mendoza insisted the Mustang belonged to the federal Wild Horse Preservation Program where he volunteered. The magnificent black stallion, still untamed and dangerous, paced nervously in a reinforced holding pen at the center of the arena. Victoria Harrington, the respected auction house director known throughout the county for her fair approach and no-nonsense attitude, called the proceedings to order with 3 sharp raps of her gavel. Her silver-streaked hair and penetrating gaze commanded immediate respect as the murmurs in the arena subsided. The auction house will now hear the ownership dispute regarding Lot 47, the black Mustang stallion, she announced, her voice clear and authoritative. Are both parties present and ready to proceed? From the plaintiff section rose Jackson Blackwell, the owner of Ravenwood Ranches. His custom-tailored Western suit complemented his meticulously groomed appearance. At 45, Blackwell had built a reputation as one of the most formidable thoroughbred breeders in the state. His confident smile revealed perfectly whitened teeth as he adjusted his designer leather belt with a massive gold buckle. Jackson Blackwell, representing Ravenwood Ranches, he announced. We are prepared to proceed. His voice carried the polished resonance of someone accustomed to commanding rooms much larger than this country auction house. Across the arena sat Gabriel Mendoza, who rose slowly to his feet. His weathered hands, darkened by decades under the sun and calloused from endless work with horses, contrasted sharply with Blackwell's manicured appearance. Mendoza wore clean but clearly aged clothes, faded jeans, a simple button-up shirt, and a well-worn leather vest that had seen countless seasons. His silver-streaked dark hair was neatly combed, and despite the gravity of the situation, his deep brown eyes held a quiet dignity. Gabriel Mendoza, ma'am. I'm representing myself today. His voice, though softer than Blackwell's, carried the solid weight of someone who chose his words with care. Director Harrington nodded. Mr. Blackwell, as the claimant, you may present your opening statement. Blackwell strode confidently to the center of the arena, turning to face both the director and the audience of local residents, horse enthusiasts, and potential buyers. His movements were practiced and precise, like a performer who had rehearsed his role countless times. Director Harrington, ladies and gentlemen, Blackwell began, gesturing smoothly as he spoke. The case before you today is straightforward. Ravenwood Ranches legally purchased the western stretch of Silver Creek Basin and all surrounding lands from the Peterson estate last year. The purchase included all grazing rights and wildlife on the property, properly filed and recorded with the county. Blackwell walked slowly before the audience, making eye contact with influential members of the community. Since acquiring this property, Ravenwood has invested considerable resources in developing a world-class thoroughbred breeding program that will bring prestige and economic growth to Silverdale Valley. However, these plans have been repeatedly hindered by wild Mustangs encroaching on our property. Blackwell turned slightly, directing everyone's attention to the magnificent black stallion in the holding pen. This particular stallion, which we've named Midnight Racer, has been documented on Ravenwood property for the past 6 months. My ranch hands successfully captured him 3 weeks ago, following all humane protocols. This horse represents a significant asset to our breeding program, with estimated value exceeding $75,000. Blackwell paused dramatically. We will present evidence showing our legal right to this animal, including boundary surveys, drone footage of the capture, and expert testimony that will prove beyond any doubt that this Mustang was captured on Ravenwood property, making it legally ours under state law. Blackwell's voice took on a tone of rehearsed compassion. While we respect Mr. Mendoza's long history with wild horses in this community, the law is clear. No one, regardless of their personal feelings about wild Mustangs, has the right to claim resources that legally belong to others. We ask this auction house to recognize our ownership and allow the sale to proceed as scheduled. As Blackwell returned to his seat, a satisfied smile played on his lips. The arena remained silent, many spectators nodding along with the compelling presentation. Director Harrington turned to Mendoza. Mr. Mendoza, your opening statement. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Gabriel Mendoza stood slowly, his joints protesting after years of hard work with powerful animals. Unlike Blackwell, he remained beside his table, one hand resting on the wooden surface for support. He didn't have notes or visual aids, just the simplicity of his words. Director Harrington, members of the community, I thank you for your time today. His voice was steady but unembellished. I'm not a lawyer or a businessman. I'm just a horse trainer who's worked with wild Mustangs since I was tall enough to reach a stirrup. Mendoza paused, looking around at the familiar faces in the arena. Many were neighbors who had known him their entire lives. I understand Ravenwood believes they own this stallion because he was captured on what they now claim as their land. I'm here to explain why that isn't so. From the claimant's table, Blackwell looked on with barely concealed amusement, exchanging knowing glances with his ranch managers. One of them leaned over and whispered something that made Blackwell smile and shake his head slightly. The spectators noticed this exchange, and a few whispers rippled through the crowd. Director Harrington cast a stern look toward the Ravenwood table, silencing them instantly. Mendoza continued, unperturbed by Blackwell's dismissive attitude. For nearly 50 years, I've worked with the wild horses of Silver Creek Basin. In our community, that herd has always been protected under federal conservation laws. They're not just animals wandering on private property, they're living heritage, descendants of the original Spanish horses that roamed these valleys centuries ago. As he spoke, Mendoza's normally quiet demeanor began to show flashes of the passion that had sustained him through decades of working with troubled and dangerous horses. I don't dispute that Ravenwood bought the Peterson property. What I dispute is that they bought rights to wild Mustangs that were never the Petersons to sell. Blackwell's expression shifted slightly, a flicker of confusion replacing his confident smile. He whispered something to his associate, who began rifling through documents. Director Harrington leaned forward, her interest visibly piqued. Continue, Mr. Mendoza. Your Honor, I've brought my own evidence today, not fancy surveys or drone footage, but something I believe holds more weight in this proceeding. The elderly horse trainer reached slowly into his worn vest pocket, his weathered hands emerging with a folded document that showed the yellowish tinge of age. The arena fell into a deeper silence, curiosity spreading across the faces of everyone present, including Jackson Blackwell, whose confident demeanor had begun to show the first signs of uncertainty. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Gabriel Mendoza carefully unfolded the yellowed document, handling it with the reverence one might show a sacred text. The paper crackled softly in the hushed arena, its sound amplified by the collective held breath of the spectators. He cleared his throat before continuing. Before I explain this document, Director Harrington, I'd like to ask Mr. Blackwell a question, if that's permitted. Director Harrington considered this unusual request for a moment. Normally, direct questioning of opposing parties is not standard procedure. Mr. Mendoza. However, she paused, studying the elderly trainer's earnest expression. I'll allow a limited question relevant to your statement. Mendoza nodded gratefully. Thank you, ma'am. He turned to face Jackson Blackwell. Mr. Blackwell, in preparing your claim, did you or your ranch conduct research on the federal protected status of the Silver Creek Basin wild horse herd? Blackwell straightened his bolo tie, visibly annoyed at being questioned by someone he clearly considered beneath him. Of course we did, Mr. Mendoza. Ravenwood Ranches employs only the most thorough due diligence procedures. We verified that no active federal designations affect our property rights. Mendoza nodded thoughtfully. I see. His weathered face revealed nothing as he turned back to the director. Ma'am, the document I'm holding is a federal wild horse preserve designation issued for Silver Creek Basin in 1971, over 50 years ago. A murmur rippled through the arena. Blackwell's ranch manager leaned forward, suddenly alert, whispering urgently to his superior. May I approach to present this document? Mendoza asked. Director Harrington nodded. You may. As Mendoza walked forward, Blackwell stood abruptly. Director, I object to this irregular presentation of evidence. Any relevant documents should have been disclosed during our preliminary discussions. Director Harrington fixed Blackwell with a stern gaze. Mr. Blackwell, as you well know, Mr. Mendoza is representing himself. While he may not have followed proper procedure for disclosure, fundamental fairness requires that I at least examine what he believes to be relevant to his defense. She turned to Mendoza. However, Mr. Mendoza, I must caution you that failure to provide proper disclosure may limit how this document can be used. Mendoza nodded respectfully. I understand, ma'am, and I apologize for my ignorance of proper procedures. Truth is, I didn't know this dispute would go this far. I thought the truth of the matter would be clear enough without a formal proceeding. He handed the document to an assistant who passed it to Director Harrington. She adjusted her reading glasses and began examining it carefully, her expression gradually shifting from professional neutrality to unmistakable interest. Blackwell, unable to contain his impatience, addressed the director. Director Harrington, while this historical curiosity may be interesting, I fail to see how a document from half a century ago could possibly supersede modern property records and transactions. Director Harrington looked up sharply. Mr. Blackwell, I would advise you to reserve judgment until you've seen what I'm looking at. She returned to her examination for another full minute before continuing. This appears to be an original Federal Wild Horse and Burro Act designation from 1971, signed by the then Secretary of the Interior, establishing Silver Creek Basin as a protected habitat for wild horses. She looked at Mendoza. Mr. Mendoza, please explain to the audience your understanding of this document's significance. Mendoza stood straighter now, gaining confidence. Director, this decree establishes federal protection for the Silver Creek wild horse herd, including the black stallion in question. It officially recognizes these animals as protected federal assets, not as property that can be claimed by landowners, even those who legally purchase the land where these horses roam. He paused, looking directly at Blackwell. In wildlife conservation law, especially in our state, federally protected species cannot be claimed as private property, regardless of where they're found. This designation establishes that the Mustang herd, including the stallion, are protected federal horses that predate any claims Ravenwood could possibly have. Blackwell was on his feet instantly. Director, this is preposterous. Mr. Mendoza clearly has no legal training, yet he's attempting to lecture us on complex wildlife conservation law. Our property deed clearly includes all wildlife rights registered with the county." "Mr. Blackwell," Director Harrington interrupted firmly, "I assure you I don't need lectures on conservation law from either of you. I served on the state's Wildlife Resources Commission before taking this position." She turned to Mendoza. "Mr. Mendoza, while this document appears authentic, we need to verify it against federal records. More importantly, we need to establish that this particular stallion is indeed part of the protected herd mentioned in this designation." Mendoza nodded calmly. "I have documentation showing my work with this specific herd for over 40 years, Director. This includes annual census reports I've filed as a volunteer with the Bureau of Land Management since 1980, tracking lineage and herd movements." He reached into his leather vest and pulled out several photographs. "I also have these photographs, documenting this specific stallion from when he was a colt 5 years ago, with distinctive markings that match exactly." As Director Harrington examined these additional documents, Mendoza continued, "There's something else that might explain how this misunderstanding occurred." He reached into his pocket and pulled out another folded paper. "This is a copy of a letter I sent to Richard Peterson, the previous landowner, in 2015, explicitly informing him that the wild horses crossing his property were federally protected and would remain under federal jurisdiction, regardless of any future land transactions." A murmur rippled through the arena. Mrs. Peterson, who was present in the audience, visibly paled. The letter includes a signed acknowledgement from Richard Peterson recognizing the protected status of these horses. Mendoza concluded, "Richard and I were neighbors for 30 years and had an understanding. I believe he simply failed to disclose this arrangement when he sold the property to Ravenwood." Blackwell was practically vibrating with frustration. "Director, this is completely irregular. More surprise evidence that wasn't properly disclosed. These are precisely the tactics that proper business procedure is designed to prevent. My ranch has invested thousands based on county records that showed no encumbrances on wildlife rights." Director Harrington raised her hand to silence him. "Mr. Blackwell, I understand your frustration. However, the preliminary evidence suggests there may be serious deficiencies in Ravenwood's claim to this stallion." She reviewed the documents once more before continuing. "Here's how we'll proceed. I'm temporarily suspending the auction of this horse until we can fully verify these documents and their implications. I'll schedule a full evidential hearing for 2 weeks from today, where both parties can present comprehensive evidence regarding the Mustang's status." She turned to Blackwell. "Mr. Blackwell, I suggest you advise your ranch to conduct a more thorough investigation into the federal protections that may affect your property. And Mr. Mendoza," she continued, looking toward the horse trainer, "you will need to provide all documentation supporting your claims about this specific stallion to Mr. Blackwell's team no later than 3 days from now." Blackwell wasn't finished. His face flushed with barely contained anger. He addressed Mendoza directly. "Mr. Mendoza, I find it telling that you conveniently waited until my ranch had invested thousands in capturing this stallion before bringing forward these supposed historical claims. One might almost suspect this is less about conservation and more about extracting a settlement from a successful business." Before Director Harrington could intervene, Mendoza responded calmly, "Mr. Blackwell, I've never been in the business of taking what isn't rightfully mine. I approached your ranch 3 times when you first purchased the property, trying to explain the situation with the wild horses. Each time, I was turned away by your managers who insisted they had handled all the legal issues. I only came forward when your ranch announced this auction, threatening to sell an animal that has been under federal protection since before you made your first million." The quietness of Mendoza's response only highlighted the contrast between the 2 men, one furious and defensive, the other composed and measured. Director Harrington tapped her gavel. "That's enough. This proceeding is adjourned until the evidential hearing 2 weeks from today. I expect both parties to conduct themselves professionally in the interim. As she rose to leave, she added, "And Mr. Blackwell, a word of advice, in matters of wildlife conservation in this county, it's often worth looking beyond standard property law. Some of our most important protections aren't immediately obvious. In modern land transactions." As the arena began to empty, Mendoza gathered his documents with care. Blackwell stormed out with his ranch team in tow, already barking instructions about emergency legal research and contingency plans. Mrs. Peterson hesitantly approached Mendoza. "Mr. Mendoza," she began, her voice thick with emotion, "I had no idea about any of this." Richard never mentioned the protected status of the horses when he was explaining the property to me before he passed. Mendoza looked up at her kindly. "Your husband and I had an understanding, Margaret. We were both people who believed a handshake meant something. I suspect he thought that understanding would continue without needing formal paperwork. I feel terrible," she admitted. "If I had known, I would have made sure Ravenwood understood the situation before the sale." Mendoza patted her hand. "Gently, don't blame yourself. Richard was a good neighbor for decades. He respected the land and its wildlife." He paused, looking past her to where the Ravenwood executives were huddled near the arena doors. Not everyone shares that respect these days. As Mendoza walked out of the arena, several community members stopped to shake his hand or pat him on the back. The county's wildlife officer, Elena Thompson, approached with a smile. "Gabriel, I nearly fell out of my chair when you pulled out that designation," she said. "I've known about the protected status of those horses my entire career. The Petersons must have known too." Mendoza smiled. "My father always told me to keep important papers close. Said you never know when the past might need to teach the present a lesson." From across the auction house lobby, Blackwell watched this exchange with narrowed eyes. His client relations manager, Trevor Hamilton, demanded answers. "How did we miss this, Blackwell? You assured me the wildlife rights were clean." Blackwell's jaw tightened. "Standard property searches don't always cover decades-old federal wildlife designations. We followed normal procedure." "Well, your normal procedure just cost us a valuable stallion and public embarrassment," Hamilton snapped. "Fix this." "I don't care how." As they exited the auction house, Blackwell cast one last glance at Mendoza, who was now surrounded by well-wishers. The ranch owner's expression hardened into resolve. This battle was far from over, but for the first time in his career, Jackson Blackwell found himself questioning whether he was fighting on the right side. The black stallion, meanwhile, watched from his pen with wild, untrusting eyes, his future hanging in the balance of a dispute between men who saw his value in fundamentally different ways. The 2 weeks before the evidential hearing passed in a flurry of activity for both sides of the dispute. Jackson Blackwell had transformed the conference room at his ranch headquarters into a war room dedicated solely to the Mendoza case. The long mahogany table disappeared beneath stacks of documents, land surveys, and wildlife law precedents. 3 legal consultants had been brought in to work exclusively on researching federal horse protection statutes and a wildlife rights. Specialists from the state capitol had been hired at considerable expense. Blackwell himself had barely left the office. The stubble on his face had grown into the beginnings of an unintentional beard, and dark circles had formed under his eyes. His usual immaculate appearance had given way to rolled-up sleeves and loosened ties. This case had become personal, a challenge to his business reputation that he couldn't afford to lose. "What do you mean you can't find any exclusions to the protection status?" Blackwell snapped at a junior attorney who had just delivered yet another disappointing update. "There has to be some provision that allows landowners to remove wild horses from private property. No conservation law is that absolute." The attorney shrunk back slightly. "We've checked federal statutes, case precedents dating back to the 1970s, and Bureau of Land Management guidelines. The Silver Creek herd has specific protected status because of their genetic purity as descendants of Spanish colonial horses. Even on private land, they remain federal assets. Blackwell ran his hands through his disheveled hair in frustration. What about the acknowledgement letter Mendoza produced? Have we verified its authenticity? The handwriting analysis just came back, another team member reported. The signature appears to be authentic. It matches other known examples of Richard Peterson's signature from county records. Blackwell paced the length of the conference room, his mind racing. There has to be something we're missing. Nobody's case is this perfect. He stopped suddenly, turning to the wildlife specialist. What about relocation rights? If we can't claim ownership, can we at least demand removal of the horses from our property? The specialist, Dr. Elena Walsh, shook her head. I've reviewed the designation documentation. The Silver Creek Basin is classified as critical habitat for this specific herd. Their migratory patterns across these lands date back centuries and are protected as an essential element of their conservation. Blackwell slammed his hand on the table in frustration, causing several document stacks to topple. Damn it! Our ranch paid premium prices for that land based on our assessment of its potential for the breeding program. If we can't control which animals access our property, the liability and operational complications could be enormous. There's something else, Dr. Walsh added hesitantly. I've been looking at historical records of the Silver Creek herd. Gabriel Mendoza is recognized in federal documentation as the primary civilian conservation partner for this herd since 1980. His expertise with these specific horses is extensively documented in government records. Blackwell stopped pacing and sank into a chair, loosening his tie further. For the first time in his career, he was facing the possibility that he might be on the wrong side of both the law and ethics. The realization was profoundly unsettling. Get Trevor on the phone, he finally said to his assistant. We need to discuss settlement options. Meanwhile, across town, Gabriel Mendoza's preparation couldn't have looked more different. His kitchen table held just a few neatly organized folders, one containing the federal protection documents, another with his census reports and herd lineage documentation, and a third with photographs documenting the black stallion's life, from colt to magnificent adult. Mendoza wasn't alone, however. Word of his confrontation with Blackwell had spread throughout the community, and several unexpected allies had appeared to offer assistance. County Wildlife Officer Elena Thompson sat across from him, helping organize historical references to the Silver Creek herd. Retired Judge Samuel Cooper, who had served on the bench for 30 years before retiring, had volunteered legal guidance. And surprisingly, Margaret Peterson herself had arrived with a box of her late husband's personal papers. I found these in Richard's study after our conversation at the auction house, she explained, carefully laying out several journals on the table. He kept detailed diaries about the ranch and his interactions with neighbors. There are multiple entries about you and your work with the wild horses. Mendoza opened one of the leather-bound journals, his weathered finger carefully tracing the handwritten entries from years past. He stopped at an entry from June 2014. Met with Gabriel today about the Mustang herd, crossing our south pasture. Reminded him, as he reminded me, that these horses are federally protected regardless of property lines. Agreed to maintain the current arrangement that has served both our lands well. A man's word still means something in this county, even if the lawyers would have us put everything in triplicate on official letterhead. Mendoza smiled softly. That sounds just like your husband. He was a man who understood respect for the land and its creatures. Margaret nodded, her eyes moist. I'm so sorry, Gabriel. When Richard passed, and I inherited the property, I had no idea about any of this. I live 3 states away and haven't been involved with the ranch for years. When Ravenwood made their offer, it seemed like the practical decision. You couldn't have known, Mendoza reassured her. Richard and I had an understanding that went beyond paperwork. That's how things were done in our generation." Judge Cooper, who had been examining the federal designation, looked up. "This diary could be crucial evidence, Gabriel. It directly supports your claim that the Peterson family was fully aware of the protected status of these horses." Elena Thompson nodded in agreement. "I found references to the Silver Creek Mustangs in county conservation records dating back to the 1960s. The historical documentation clearly establishes both the herd's protected status and your long-standing role in their preservation." Mendoza took a sip from his coffee cup, considering the information before him. Unlike Blackwell's frantic preparation, his approach was measured and calm. "I never wanted this fight," he said quietly. "All I've ever wanted was to protect these horses the same way my father taught me, and his father before him." "Well, you may not have wanted the fight, but you're certainly prepared for it," Judge Cooper observed with admiration. "In 40 years, on and around the bench, I've rarely seen someone walk into a hearing with such a strong position, especially against the kind of legal firepower Ravenwood has brought in." Elena Thompson added, "The community's behind you, Gabriel. Everyone's talking about how you stood up to Blackwell. My niece said her wildlife management professor at the university is already using your case as an example in his conservation law class." Mendoza shook his head modestly. "I'm not looking to be anyone's example. I just want what's right for the horses, no more, no less." The ringing of Mendoza's landline telephone interrupted their conversation. Mendoza excused himself and went to answer it. The others couldn't hear the conversation, but they watched as Mendoza's expression shifted from surprise to thoughtful consideration. When he returned to the table, there was a new gravity to his demeanor. "That was Jackson Blackwell," he announced. "He wants to meet tomorrow to discuss a potential settlement." The following day, Blackwell arrived at Mendoza's modest ranch precisely at the agreed time of 10 o'clock a.m. He had made an effort to restore his professional appearance, though the signs of stress remained visible in the tightness around his eyes. As he stepped out of his luxury SUV, the ranch owner took a moment to survey the property. Mendoza's place was small by modern standards, about 40 acres of well-maintained pastures, bordered by mature cottonwood trees. The ranch house itself was an older single-story structure with a wide front porch, clearly built in another era but meticulously maintained. Unlike the manicured corporate grounds of Ravenwood, this place had a lived-in authenticity that couldn't be manufactured. Trevor Hamilton stepped forward, clearly eager to put a corporate spin on the situation. "Ravenwood Ranches has always been committed to honoring the communities where we operate. Our new conservation initiative will showcase how thoughtful development can preserve natural heritage while creating economic opportunities." As the corporate executive continued with practiced talking points about sustainable development and community values, Mendoza quietly stepped away from the media scrum. Blackwell noticed and excused himself to follow. He caught up with Mendoza near the auction house steps. "Mr. Mendoza, there's something I've been meaning to say to you privately." Mendoza paused, turning to face the ranch owner with a questioning. "Look, I owe you an apology," Blackwell said, the words clearly unfamiliar on his tongue. "My dismissive attitude toward your expertise was not only unprofessional, but profoundly mistaken. You've taught me more about both horse conservation and integrity in the past 2 weeks than I learned in 20 years of business." A faint smile crossed Mendoza's face. "Apology accepted, Mr. Blackwell, though I suspect you're being too hard on yourself and too generous to me." "No," Blackwell insisted, "I'm not. When I visited your ranch and saw those rescue horses, the ones everyone else had given up on, I realized something that's been missing in my approach to business. I've been so focused on building a reputation that I sometimes forget to ask whether I should be pursuing certain goals in the first place." Mendoza considered this thoughtfully. "It's never too late to ask better questions, Mr. Blackwell." The ranch owner nodded, extending his hand. "Please call me Jackson." "Only if you'll call me Gabriel," Mendoza replied, shaking Blackwell's hand firmly. As they parted ways at the bottom of the auction house steps, Margaret Peterson approached. Mendoza. She had been waiting discreetly throughout the proceedings. "I heard about the settlement," she said. "I just wanted to thank you for not holding my ignorance against me. If I had known about Richard's understanding with you about the horses, I never would have sold the land without disclosing that information." Mendoza smiled kindly. "Your husband was a good man and a good neighbor, Margaret. He would be proud of how you've handled this situation." He patted her hand gently. "Sometimes we have to rediscover the things our parents and grandparents knew but didn't write down for us." 3 weeks later, a small ceremony was held at the boundary between Ravenwood Ranches and what would become the Silver Creek Wildlife Corridor. County officials, local residents, and Ravenwood representatives gathered for the dedication of a conservation marker. The black stallion that had been at the center of the dispute had been returned to the wild the previous week after being fitted with a minimally invasive tracking device that would allow researchers to better understand the herd's movements. Blackwell stood at the edge of the newly established corridor, checking his watch and glancing down the path, looking for a familiar figure. Right on time, he spotted Gabriel Mendoza making his way along the trail. The horse trainer had slowed considerably, walking with the assistance of a carved wooden cane, but his back remained straight and his eyes clear. "Good morning, Gabriel," Blackwell called out as Mendoza approached. "Jackson," Mendoza nodded in greeting. "Appreciate you making the time for this. Not often we get a visit from the newly appointed chairman of the State Equine Conservation Fund." Blackwell smiled at the mention of his recent appointment. "Some meetings are worth the effort. Besides, I wanted to see how the conservation corridor is working in practice. Your case has become something of a template for the region." They began walking together along the path that followed the natural migration route of the wild horses. On one side lay Ravenwood's carefully managed breeding facilities with its world-class thoroughbreds. On the other stretched the wild landscape where the Mustangs roamed freely. "The agreement has held up well," Mendoza confirmed. "The corridor gives the herd what they need for migration and water access, and your wildlife-friendly fencing has prevented any accidental injuries or entrapments." Blackwell nodded, professionally satisfied, but also personally pleased. "The governor mentioned your case specifically when she signed the new Wildlife Heritage Preservation Act last month. The Mendoza provision requires historical conservation, claims to be researched beyond standard property assessments." Mendoza chuckled softly. "Never thought I'd have a law named after me. My grandfather would have found that quite amusing." They reached a small observation platform overlooking both the ranch operations and the wild country beyond. Seated inside was a young woman in her early 30s, her notebook open and pen ready. Lisa Chun was a professor of wildlife management from the state university who had written extensively about the Mendoza case and its implications for conservation law. "Professor Chun," Blackwell greeted her. "Thank you for joining us. I hope we haven't kept you waiting." "Not at all," she replied, standing to shake hands with both men. "It's an honor to have both of you participate in my research. This case study will be central to the new textbook on collaborative conservation approaches." Once seated on the platform, Professor Chun began her interview. "Mr. Mendoza, in the months since your case was resolved, how has the arrangement affected your conservation work?" Mendoza considered her question thoughtfully. "The guaranteed protection of the migration corridor has actually improved the herd's situation. Knowing exactly what routes are safe has allowed me to better monitor their health and numbers. And I've adopted some of the technological tracking methods that Ravenwood implemented. Turns out old horse trainers can learn new techniques after all." His eyes twinkled with self-deprecating humor. "And Mr. Blackwell," Chun turned to the ranch owner, "your business approach changed dramatically after this case. Could you elaborate on that decision?" Blackwell glanced at Mendoza before responding. This case made me confront some uncomfortable truths about my approach to business. I had been trained to see property disputes as battlegrounds where victory was the only acceptable outcome. But Gabriel showed me that sometimes the most durable resolutions come when both parties recognize the legitimacy in each other's position. He paused, gathering his thoughts. After 15 years of corporate ranching, I realized I wanted to help shape policy that balances development needs with preservation of natural heritage and wildlife resources. The Conservation Fund offered that opportunity. It's fascinating how a single case can have such profound impacts, Chun observed, making notes. Mr. Mendoza, your response to Mr. Blackwell's initial dismissal of your expertise has become somewhat legendary in conservation circles. Was that a prepared statement? Mendoza laughed, a warm sound that carried across the landscape. Heavens! No. When you've lived as long as I have, you don't need to rehearse the truth. I just spoke what I've always known, that wisdom and formal education don't always travel together. Blackwell smiled at the memory, no longer embarrassed by his former arrogance. That moment at the auction house has become a personal touchstone for me. I've cited Gabriel's words in at least a dozen speeches to business students about the difference between winning arguments and finding lasting solutions. Their conversation continued for over an hour, exploring the technical aspects of the conservation agreement and its broader implications for similar disputes. As Professor Chun packed away her materials, she had one final question. The agreement included an unusual provision for monthly demonstrations where Mr. Mendoza shows Ravenwood staff his horse gentling techniques. I understand you've both participated in these sessions. Why maintain that personal involvement when trainers or managers could handle it? The two men exchanged a glance that communicated months of mutual respect. Some agreements need more than signatures on paper to maintain them, Mendoza replied. They need continued understanding between people. Blackwell nodded in agreement. And some relationships, even those born from conflict, become valuable enough to maintain. After Professor Chun departed, Blackwell and Mendoza continued their walk along the conservation corridor. They passed several Ravenwood staff members who greeted Mendoza with warm familiarity. Far from resenting the conservation agreement, the ranch hands had become something of a protection force for the wild horses, often reporting poachers or tourists who ventured too close to the herd. I've been meaning to tell you, Mendoza said. As they walked, my granddaughter Sophia has decided to take over my conservation work when I retire. She's finishing her degree in wildlife biology at the university this year. Blackwell's eyebrows rose in pleasant surprise. That's wonderful news, Gabriel. I remember you mentioning you weren't sure if any of your grandchildren would want to continue your work with the wild horses. Mendoza nodded, his expression a mixture of pride and contentment. She grew up hearing the story of our dispute. Says it taught her that fighting for what matters can make a difference that lasts beyond your own time. That's wonderful news, Mendoza said, embracing his granddaughter. Your grandmother would have been so proud to see this. As they walked toward the house to review the plans over coffee, Sophia updated them on the latest research from the university's wildlife management department. The tracking data from the Black Stallion, now the undisputed leader of the Silver Creek herd, had revealed fascinating migration patterns that no one had previously documented. The herd's range is nearly twice what we estimated, she explained, spreading maps across Mendoza's kitchen table. They're following ancient pathways that correspond to seasonal grazing patterns established centuries ago. Blackwell studied the maps with interest. Some of these routes cross 3 different private properties besides Ravenwood. Sophia nodded. That's why we're proposing an expanded conservation corridor. The data makes a compelling case for a more comprehensive approach. Have you approached the other landowners? Blackwell asked. Not yet, she admitted. We wanted to have the research solid before making any proposals. Blackwell smiled. Let me help with that. Coming from the chairman of the State Equine Conservation Fund, it might carry additional weight. As they discussed the logistics of the expanded corridor, Mendoza mostly listened, occasionally offering insights born from decades of observation. The collaboration between his traditional knowledge and Sophia's scientific approach had proven remarkably effective, creating conservation strategies that were both biologically sound and practically implementable. Later that afternoon, as Blackwell prepared to leave, he paused on the porch with Mendoza. "I've been thinking about what you said 6 months ago, about making decisions with an eye toward those who come after us." Mendoza nodded, waiting for him to continue. "Ravenwood's board meets next week to discuss our 10-year development plan," Blackwell said. "I'm proposing that we dedicate 20% of our holdings as permanent conservation easements, not just for the wild horses, but for all native wildlife." Mendoza's eyebrows rose in surprise. "That's a significant commitment. Jackson, will your shareholders support it?" 5 years ago they wouldn't have," Blackwell admitted. "But our partnership with your conservation efforts has actually increased our property values and enhanced our brand. It turns out that being known for environmental stewardship is good business in today's world." He looked out over the pastures where rescued horses now grazed peacefully. "More importantly, it's the right thing to do. Your approach to that troubled gelding today, that patience and understanding rather than force, it's changed how I think about my relationship with the land itself." Mendoza nodded thoughtfully. "The land speaks to us if we're willing to listen, just like the horses do. Most people are just too busy or too certain of their own importance to hear it." As they shook hands in farewell, a truck pulled up carrying the local veterinarian who had come for routine checkups on Mendoza's rescue horses. Dr. Sarah Williams had been skeptical of Mendoza's methods when she first began practicing in Silverdale Valley, but over the years had become one of his strongest advocates in the professional community. "Mr. Blackwell," she called out in surprise as she gathered her equipment. "I didn't expect to see the chairman of the Conservation Fund out here today." "Monthly meeting," Blackwell explained with a smile. "Can't miss Gabriel's wisdom sessions." The veterinarian nodded knowingly. "You're not the only convert. Half the ranchers in the county who used to mock his horse whispering are now on his waiting list." "They're not on any waiting list," Mendoza protested modestly. "I'm happy to help anyone who genuinely wants to learn. And that's precisely why you're booked solid for the next year." Dr. Williams laughed, heading toward the stables. Blackwell turned back to Mendoza. "She's right, you know. Your influence is spreading far beyond this valley. The techniques you demonstrated at the state fair last month are being talked about in training circles across the country." Mendoza shook his head in wonder. "All I ever wanted was to help horses that were suffering and protect the wild ones that deserve their freedom. I never set out to change how people think." "That's exactly why it's happening," Blackwell replied. "True wisdom doesn't announce itself, it simply demonstrates a better way." As Blackwell drove away, Mendoza watched his departing vehicle with a sense of quiet satisfaction. The unlikely friendship that had developed between them represented something profound, the possibility that different worlds, different values, and different approaches could not only coexist, but strengthen each other. He turned his attention to the round pen where the once dangerous gelding was now calmly accepting Dr. Williams' examination. The horse's transformation was a visible reminder of what patience, understanding, and respect could accomplish. Not just with animals, but with people and communities as well. That evening, as the sun set over Silverdale Valley, casting long shadows across both Mendoza's modest ranch and Ravenwood's expansive holdings, the wild Mustangs led by the black stallion appeared along the ridgeline. They moved with the same freedom they had enjoyed for centuries, unaware that their very existence had catalyzed a profound change in how humans viewed their relationship with the natural world. Mendoza stood on his porch, watching them silently as he had done thousands of times before. But now he watched with the knowledge that their future was more secure than it had been in decades, protected not just by laws and documents, but by a community that had rediscovered the value of wild things. In the distance he could see lights coming on at Ravenwood headquarters, where Blackwell was hosting representatives from neighboring ranches to discuss the expanded conservation corridor. What had begun as one man's stand against corporate interests had evolved into a collaborative movement that was transforming the entire valley. As darkness fell and the wild horses disappeared into the night, Mendoza smiled to himself. There was still much work to be done, challenges to overcome, and new threats to face. But for tonight, he could rest in the knowledge that dignity, spoken with quiet conviction at the right moment, had created ripples that would continue long after he was gone. In his weathered hands he held the future, not by controlling it, but by showing others how to listen to the wisdom that had always been there, waiting to be heard. 1 year had passed since the day a humble horse trainer stood in a county auction house and responded to a wealthy ranch owner's mockery with words that would echo through generations. The world of Silverdale Valley had changed dramatically in those 12 months. Relationships had been forged, perspectives had shifted, and a new model of conservation had taken root that balanced traditional wisdom with modern progress. On this bright spring morning, the grand opening of the Silver Creek Wild Horse Educational Center was drawing visitors from across the country. The state-of-the-art facility, built on the boundary between Mendoza's ranch and Ravenwood property, represented a physical manifestation of the bridge that had been built between two seemingly incompatible worlds. Sophia Mendoza, now the center's executive director, stood at the podium addressing the gathered crowd. Behind her, a massive window framed the wild landscape where the Mustang herd could occasionally be glimpsed, moving freely through their protected habitat. This center exists because two men chose understanding over conflict, she said, her voice carrying across the attentive audience. My grandfather, Gabriel Mendoza, and Jackson Blackwell of Ravenwood Ranches showed us that when wisdom and resources align, remarkable things become possible. In the front row, Gabriel Mendoza listened with quiet pride. At 66, his health had begun to show signs of decline, but his mind remained sharp and his connection to the horses undiminished. Beside him sat Jackson Blackwell, who had become not just a business partner but a genuine friend. Their weekly conversations about conservation, business ethics, and the future of the valley had become a cornerstone of both men's lives. Today, we dedicate this center not just to wild horse preservation, Sophia continued, but to the philosophy that has guided my grandfather's work for over 50 years, that understanding must precede action, that patience yields results force never could, and that the natural world speaks to us if we're humble enough to listen. As the ceremony concluded and visitors began touring the facility, Mendoza and Blackwell found a quiet moment away from the crowds. They stood at the edge of the educational arena where demonstrations of natural horsemanship would soon begin. Your granddaughter has your gift for expressing complex ideas simply, Blackwell observed. Mendoza nodded. She has her grandmother's intelligence and her mother's determination, a formidable combination. They watched as school children pressed their faces against the viewing windows, pointing excitedly at the informational displays about Mustang behavior and conservation history. Did you ever imagine it would come to this? Blackwell asked, gesturing toward the center with its research facilities, educational programs, and community outreach initiatives. Not in my wildest dreams, Mendoza admitted. I was just trying to protect horses that needed protection. All this. He waved his hand, encompassing the center and all it represented. This is beyond anything I could have envisioned. Blackwell smiled. That's how the most meaningful changes often happen, not through grand strategic plans, but through one person standing firmly for what they believe in. As they spoke, Dr. Williams approached with an urgent expression. Gabriel, the new rescue just arrived. It's worse than we expected." Without hesitation, both men followed the veterinarian to the rehabilitation barn attached to the center. Inside, a severely malnourished paint horse stood trembling in a padded stall, its eyes wild with fear and pain. 3 assistants stood nearby, uncertain how to approach the traumatized animal. "The seizure team found him locked in a shed, Doctor," Williams explained quietly. "The owner's been charged with animal cruelty. They've never seen a horse this psychologically damaged that didn't have to be euthanized." Mendoza studied the horse thoughtfully, noting its body language and a particular quality of fear in its eyes. "He's not beyond reach," he said with quiet certainty. Blackwell and the others watched as Mendoza slowly entered the stall, making himself small, non-threatening. He didn't approach the horse directly but settled himself on a bale of hay in the corner, his movements deliberate and calm. Then he did something unexpected. He began to hum softly, a gentle melody that seemed to fill the stall with peace. "What's he doing?" One of the assistants whispered to Blackwell. "Something his grandfather taught him," Blackwell replied. "The vibration of humming carries differently than speaking. It soothes in a way words can't." For nearly an hour Mendoza simply sat, occasionally humming, occasionally silent, but always present with the frightened animal. Gradually, imperceptibly, the horse's trembling subsided. Its breathing slowed. The wild panic in its eyes began to recede. By the time Sophia came looking for them, concerned about their absence from the opening festivities, a remarkable transformation had occurred. The horse that had been deemed beyond saving was now standing with its head lowered beside Mendoza, who was gently stroking its neck and speaking to it in words too soft for the others to hear. "We should get back to the guests," Blackwell said quietly to Sophia. "Your grandfather is doing what he does best." As they walked back toward the main building, Sophia shook her head in amazement. "I've seen him work with hundreds of horses, and it still seems like magic every time." "Not magic," Blackwell corrected her. "Wisdom, the kind that comes from truly seeing another being for what it is, not what you want it to be." The grand opening continued throughout the day, with demonstrations, speeches, and tours. The governor arrived to cut the ceremonial ribbon, praising the center as a model for public-private conservation partnerships. Media covered the event extensively, spreading the story of Silverdale Valley's transformation to audiences nationwide. But for those who understood what had truly happened here, the most significant moment of the day occurred when Gabriel Mendoza emerged from the rehabilitation barn late in the afternoon, tired but satisfied, having connected with a horse that everyone else had deemed unreachable. As the crowds began to disperse and the sun dipped toward the horizon, Mendoza and Blackwell found themselves once again on the ridge, overlooking both their properties. The conservation corridor stretched before them, a testament to what was possible when adversaries became allies. "The state legislature votes next week on the Expanded Protection Act," Blackwell said. "Every indication is that it will pass unanimously." Mendoza nodded. "The Blackwell-Mendoza framework, they're calling it now. Strange to think our names will be in the law books." "Not so strange," Blackwell replied. "What happened here is worth remembering, worth codifying into law. The idea that protection and progress can coexist, that traditional wisdom and modern business can strengthen each other rather than compete." As they stood in companionable silence, the black stallion appeared on the opposite ridge, his powerful form silhouetted against the setting sun. Behind him, the herd moved like a living shadow across the landscape, free and wild as they had been for centuries. "He still comes to the boundary sometimes," Mendoza said softly, "watching us as we watch him, reminding us that we're the visitors in his world, not the other way around." Blackwell nodded. "I've come to believe that's the heart of what you taught me, Gabriel, that true strength isn't about dominance or control. It's about understanding your place in a larger system, and respecting the wisdom inherent in things that existed long before you arrived. As darkness fell over Silverdale Valley, lights came on at the new educational center, where the evening program was beginning, a special presentation for local ranchers about implementing wildlife-friendly practices on working lands. "We should join them," Mendoza said, turning toward the lights. "In a moment," Blackwell replied. "I just want to watch this a little longer." Together they stood in the gathering darkness, two men from different worlds who had found common ground. Not by compromising their values, but by recognizing the wisdom in each other's perspective. Below them, the valley that had been the site of bitter conflict now stood as a testament to what was possible when dignity prevailed over mockery, when understanding replaced judgment, and when the future was viewed not as something to control, but as a shared legacy to protect. The black stallion raised his head, sensing their presence across the distance. For a moment, horse and humans regarded each other across the divide. Wild and domestic, freedom and civilization, nature and humanity, not as adversaries, but as equal inhabitants of a shared world. Then the stallion turned, leading his herd back into the wild country, disappearing like a dream into the night. But unlike a dream, the impact of what had transpired in Silverdale Valley would remain, flowing outward like ripples from a stone. Dropped in still water, touching lives and transforming relationships in ways that would continue long after the men who started it were gone. In the quiet darkness, Mendoza placed a hand on Blackwell's shoulder. "Come," he said simply. "There's still work to be done." And together they walked toward the light, carrying with them the profound understanding that the most enduring legacy is not what we build or own, but how we treat each other and the world we temporarily inhabit. A legacy built not on power or wealth, but on wisdom spoken with dignity at precisely the right moment. 10 years had passed since the historic confrontation that had forever changed Silverdale Valley. What had begun as a bitter dispute between a corporate ranch owner and an elderly horse trainer had blossomed into a pioneering conservation model studied and implemented across the country. On a warm summer morning, Sophia Mendoza stood at the edge of the eastern pasture, surveying the land that had been her grandfather's legacy. At 42, she embodied both the traditional values Gabriel had instilled in her and the innovative approaches of her wildlife biology education. Her dark hair was streaked with premature silver, her hands showing the beginning signs of the same weathering that had marked her grandfathers after decades of working with horses. Today was a significant milestone for both the Mendoza family and the broader community. The 10th anniversary of the Silver Creek Wild Horse Educational Center was being celebrated with an event that would bring together key figures from the original dispute, along with state officials, academics, and community members who had been touched by the remarkable partnership that had developed. Sophia checked her watch. She had just enough time to finish her morning inspection before visitors would begin arriving. As she walked along the conservation corridor that now stretched for 15 miles through Silverdale Valley, connecting 6 ranches in a continuous protected habitat, she noted with satisfaction how the wildlife monitoring systems were capturing extraordinary data about the interactions between the wild horses and other native species. The integration of her grandfather's traditional knowledge with cutting-edge conservation technology had created outcomes that neither approach could have achieved alone. The sound of tires on gravel drew her attention to the center's main entrance. A government vehicle had pulled up, and Jackson Blackwell emerged. Now in his mid-50s, his hair had turned completely silver, though he still carried himself with the same precision and purpose that had characterized him a decade earlier. As the Secretary of Environmental Resources for the State Cabinet, position he had been appointed to 3 years prior, he had become one of the most influential voices in regional conservation policy. "Sophia," he greeted her warmly as she approached. "The center looks magnificent. Your grandfather would be proud." "Secretary Blackwell," she replied with a smile, shaking his hand. Grandpa would say it's thriving because of good horses and better sense. Blackwell chuckled at the reference to one of Gabriel Mendoza's favorite sayings. How's the memorial coming along? Ready for the unveiling? Sophia nodded. The sculptors finished the final touches yesterday. It captures him perfectly, not posed or formal, just Grandpa in his element with a horse. It had been 3 years since Gabriel Mendoza had passed peacefully in his sleep at the age of 73. His last day had been spent fittingly gentling a rescue horse that everyone else had deemed too traumatized to save. The animal now served as the center's ambassador, demonstrating to visitors the transformative power of patience and understanding. As more vehicles began arriving, local officials, representatives from conservation organizations, members of the State Wildlife Board, and even Professor Chun, whose textbook on the Mendoza-Blackwell approach was now required reading in wildlife management programs across the country, Sophia led Blackwell to a quiet spot overlooking the wild horse sanctuary. "There's something I've been meaning to discuss with you," she said. "The university has approached me about establishing a permanent academic chair in traditional ecological knowledge, focusing on integrating indigenous and traditional practices with modern conservation science." "That's fantastic," Blackwell responded. "No one is better qualified to shape that program than you," Sophia smiled. "Actually, I was hoping you might consider serving on the advisory board. Your perspective on how business interests and conservation can strengthen each other would be invaluable." Blackwell nodded thoughtfully. "I'd be honored. It feels like the natural continuation of what your grandfather and I started." As they walked toward the main pavilion where the day's ceremony would begin, they passed the rehabilitation center, where 6 previously abused horses were in various stages of recovery. The Mendoza method, as it had come to be known, had been formally documented and was now being taught to trainers around the world, saving countless equine lives that would have otherwise been lost. "Your grandfather's techniques have spread far beyond what either of us could have imagined," Blackwell observed. "I was in Australia last month for a conservation conference, and they're using his approach with wild brumbies in the outback." Sophia nodded. "He never sought recognition. He just wanted to share what worked." "That's precisely why his influence has been so profound," Blackwell replied. "True wisdom doesn't announce itself with fanfare, it simply demonstrates a better way until that way becomes the new standard." As they entered the pavilion, they were greeted by Trevor Hamilton, once Blackwell's client relations manager at Ravenwood, now the CEO of the ranch operations. The transformation in Hamilton had perhaps been the most surprising of all. Once focused solely on profit margins and corporate expansion, he had become one of the region's most vocal advocates for sustainable ranching practices. "Sophia, Mr. Secretary," Hamilton greeted them. "We've just received word that the governor's helicopter is 10 minutes out. The national press is already setting up near the memorial site." What had begun as a local dispute had captured national attention over the years, becoming a case study in how conservation conflicts could be resolved through mutual respect rather than legal battles. The Silverdale model, as policy experts called it, had been implemented in various forms across the country, saving millions in litigation costs while producing better outcomes for both landowners and wildlife. As the ceremony preparations continued, Margaret Peterson approached Sophia. Now in her 70s, she had become a devoted volunteer at the center, finding purpose in supporting the legacy that her late husband had helped establish through his friendship with Gabriel Mendoza. "I found something while cleaning out the last of Richard's old files," she said, handing Sophia a faded photograph. "I thought today would be the perfect time to share it." The image showed a much younger Gabriel Mendoza and Richard Peterson, standing together beside a magnificent black stallion, clearly the predecessor of the current herd's lead stallion. The men were smiling, their posture relaxed and familiar, embodying the neighborly understanding that had protected the horses for decades, before corporations and legal disputes had entered the picture. "This must be from the 1980s, Sophia said. Studying the image with wonder, Margaret nodded. 1982. Richard wrote on the back that it was taken the day they agreed to work together to protect the herd, regardless of property lines. Sophia held the photograph carefully. "Would you mind if we include this in the memorial display? It shows exactly what Grandpa believed in, that relationships between people are what ultimately protect the things that matter." As the time for the ceremony approached, the pavilion filled with attendees from across the state and beyond. Former adversaries sat side by side, united by the shared vision that had emerged from conflict. Ranchers whose families had competed for generations now collaborated on conservation initiatives. Wildlife officials who had once enforced regulations with rigid bureaucracy now worked alongside community members to develop flexible, effective solutions. At precisely noon, the governor's helicopter appeared overhead, landing on the designated pad near the center's main building. As the governor and her entourage made their way to the pavilion, Sophia took her place at the podium, ready to welcome everyone to this milestone celebration. 10 years ago, she began, her voice clear and confident. Many people believed that the interests of wild horses and ranch operations were fundamentally incompatible. Many believed that traditional knowledge and modern science couldn't meaningfully inform each other. Many believed that business success and environmental stewardship were opposing forces. She paused, looking out over the assembled faces. Today, we stand as living proof that those beliefs were wrong. The Silver Creek Wild Horse Educational Center exists because two men, my grandfather, Gabriel Mendoza, and Jackson Blackwell, had the courage to question those assumptions, and the wisdom to see beyond their immediate differences. As Sophia continued her address, a murmur of excitement rippled through the crowd. On the ridge beyond the center, the wild horse herd had appeared, led by the majestic black stallion descended from the very animal that had been at the center of the original dispute. Almost as if they sensed the significance of the day, the horses stood outlined against the sky, wild and free, yet deeply connected to the human story unfolding below. "If there was one thing my grandfather understood," Sophia continued, gesturing toward the horses, "it was that wisdom often comes not from imposing our will on the world, but from the humility to listen to what the world is trying to tell us." Whether working with a traumatized rescue horse or protecting a wild herd, his approach was always the same: patience, respect, and the understanding that sometimes the strongest action is to create space for others to find their own way. Following Sophia's welcome, the governor spoke about the economic and environmental benefits that had flowed from the Silverdale model. Jackson Blackwell addressed the gathering on the evolution of conservation policy, and Trevor Hamilton presented impressive statistics on how Ravenwood's sustainable practices had actually increased profitability while reducing environmental impact. But the most powerful moment came when the crowd moved to the memorial site for the unveiling of Gabriel Mendoza's statue. The bronze sculpture showed the horse trainer in a moment of quiet connection with a wild Mustang, not touching, but communicating across the space between them. The plaque bore his most famous quote, "Understanding must precede action. Patience yields results, force never could." As Blackwell and Sophia together pulled the cord to remove the covering, a hush fell over the gathering. The statue seemed almost alive in the midday sun, capturing not just Gabriel's likeness, but the essence of his approach to horses and to life itself. "My grandfather never sought monuments or recognition," Sophia said, her voice thick with emotion. "But he did want his knowledge to outlive him, not for his own sake, but for the horses he loved and the land he cherished. This memorial stands not just to honor one man, but to remind us all that the most powerful force for change is dignity spoken with quiet conviction." The day continued with demonstrations, panel discussions, and tours of the expanded conservation corridor. Visitors marveled at how the wild horses now moved freely across a landscape that integrated protected habitat with working ranches, creating a mosaic of views that benefited all parties. As the formal activities wound down and the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, Sophia found a quiet moment with Blackwell on the observation deck overlooking the valley. "There's something I've been wanting to show you," she said, producing a worn leather journal from her bag. "I found this among Grandpa's things. It's his diary from the time of your dispute and reconciliation." Blackwell accepted the journal with surprise. "I had no idea Gabriel kept such detailed records." "He didn't usually," Sophia explained. "But he said that period was so important. He wanted to remember exactly how it unfolded." Blackwell carefully opened the journal, his fingers tracing Gabriel's neat, unpretentious handwriting. He stopped at an entry dated the day after their first meeting at Mendoza's ranch, the day that had marked the beginning of their unlikely friendship. "Met with Blackwell today," he read aloud. "Expected arrogance and legal threats. Found instead a man beginning to question his own certainties. Perhaps there is hope for understanding after all. Not agreement, that may be too much to expect, but genuine understanding of each other's position. And that, I have always believed, is where true solutions begin." Blackwell looked up, visibly moved. "He saw something in me that day that I didn't yet see in myself." "That was his gift," Sophia replied. "Seeing the potential in others before they recognized it themselves. He did it with horses, and he did it with people." As they continued to page through the journal, they found a particularly poignant entry from the day the conservation agreement had been signed. "Blackwell asked me today why I didn't respond with anger when he mocked my methods at the auction house. The truth is simpler than he might imagine. Anger clouds vision, both yours and the other person's. Clear vision is required to find the path where none seems to exist. The horses taught me this. A frightened horse doesn't need more fear. It needs someone who remains calm when everything around them is chaos." Blackwell closed the journal gently. "I've carried that lesson with me into every negotiation, every policy discussion since then. It transformed not just how I approach conservation, but how I approach life itself." As evening settled over Silverdale Valley, most of the visitors had departed, leaving only staff and a few close associates to reflect on the day's significance. The wild horses had returned to their evening grazing grounds, visible as distant figures moving peacefully across the protected landscape. "Will you stay for dinner?" Sophia asked as they walked back toward the main building. "Some of the original supporters are gathering for a more private celebration." Blackwell smiled. "I wouldn't miss it. Though I should warn you, the governor has asked me to consider a federal appointment. I may be spending more time in Washington soon." Sophia raised an eyebrow. "National Wildlife Conservation Director?" "Something like that," he acknowledged. "If I accept, I'd want your input on expanding the Silverdale model to federal lands." "Grandpa would say you're getting too important for your own good," Sophia laughed. "But he'd be the first to admit that your influence has been essential to everything we've accomplished here." That evening, as they gathered around a table filled with locally produced food, the conversation flowed easily between people who had once been divided by seemingly irreconcilable differences. Margaret Peterson shared stories of her husband's early friendship with Gabriel. Trevor Hamilton recounted the business community's initial skepticism about the conservation agreement and how thoroughly that skepticism had been disproven by subsequent events. "I was Blackwell's strongest critic when he first proposed the partnership," Hamilton admitted. "I thought he'd lost his mind, compromising with someone who had no economic leverage whatsoever." "And now?" Sophia prompted. "Now I understand. What he saw that the rest of us missed," Hamilton replied. "Gabriel wasn't just right about the horses, he was right about a fundamentally different way of relating to the natural world. One that ultimately makes more sense, even from a business perspective." As the evening progressed, they moved to the center's main viewing platform, where a telescope had been set up to observe the horses in the moonlight. The technology, which used thermal imaging to avoid disturbing the animals with artificial light, allowed them to witness the herd's natural behavior without interference. Through the viewfinder, they could see the black stallion standing guard while the rest of the herd rested. His vigilance, his clear sense of responsibility to the group, embodied exactly the kind of leadership that Gabriel had modeled throughout his life. He protects without controlling, Sophia observed. Gives each horse the freedom to be itself while maintaining the boundaries that keep the herd safe. Grandpa always said there was profound wisdom in how wild horses organize themselves, if only we'd pay attention. As the night deepened and stars appeared above Silverdale Valley, the small group fell into contemplative silence. 10 years had transformed not just the physical landscape, but the human community that inhabited it. Relationships had been healed. Perspectives had been broadened, and a new generation was being raised with an understanding that transcended the old conflicts. "I've been thinking about what makes your grandfather's legacy so enduring," Blackwell said finally. "It wasn't just his horse training techniques or his conservation advocacy, remarkable as those were. What was it then?" Sophia asked. "It was his fundamental belief in the possibility of change, not through force or manipulation, but through patience and authentic connection," Blackwell replied. "In a world increasingly dominated by quick fixes and power plays, he demonstrated an entirely different approach. And its effectiveness was so undeniable that it couldn't be ignored, even by people like me who initially dismissed it." As they prepared to depart, each returning to their respective responsibilities, Sophia handed Blackwell a small wooden box crafted from an oak tree that had fallen on her grandfather's property. "Grandpa wanted you to have this," she said. "He set it aside before he passed." Inside the box, Blackwell found a simple braided horsehair bracelet and a handwritten note in Gabriel's distinctive script. "Jackson, this is made from the mane of that black stallion we argued over all those years ago. He gave it willingly during our last encounter before he returned to the wild. May it remind you, as it has reminded me, that the most valuable things in life aren't those we conquer or control, but those we respect enough to meet on their own terms, with gratitude for the journey we've shared, Gabriel." Blackwell carefully slipped the bracelet onto his wrist, visibly moved by this final connection to his unlikely friend and mentor. "I'll wear it to Washington," he said quietly. "A reminder of what's possible when we lead with understanding rather than assumption." As Sophia walked into his car, the lights of the educational center glowed behind them, a beacon of hope. In a world that too often defaulted to conflict rather than collaboration, what had begun with a moment of mockery had evolved into a legacy that would continue to shape lives and landscapes for generations to come. "Safe travels, Mr. Secretary," Sophia said, extending her hand. "Grandpa would say you're finally getting the hang of things." Blackwell laughed, shaking her hand warmly. 10 years later, I'm still learning from him. That's the thing about true wisdom. It keeps teaching long after the teacher is gone." As he drove away, Blackwell caught a final glimpse in his rearview mirror of the memorial statue silhouetted against the night sky. The figure of Gabriel Mendoza stood as he had in life, patient, observant, connected to the horses and the land in a way that transcended ordinary understanding. The black stallion's hair around his wrist seemed to catch the moonlight, a tangible reminder that the most profound changes often begin not with grand strategies or forceful actions, but with a simple moment of dignity in the face of disrespect, a moment that creates ripples that continue to spread outward, touching lives and transforming relationships in ways that endure long after the moment itself has passed into memory. In Silverdale Valley, that legacy lived on in the free-roaming horses, in the thriving conservation programs, in the transformed relationships between former adversaries, and in countless individuals who had learned that understanding must precede action, and that patience yields results force never could. A legacy built not on power or wealth, but on wisdom spoken with dignity at precisely the right moment. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.